There we are, and YouTube even says that it's working. Very good. Let's get my screen back. All right, we'll just give it another minute or so and then get down to work. It's nice to be back. Nice to be able to study together again. Just another minute or two to let people log in. And then we will get rolling. I mean, it always feels longer when waiting than it is. All right, I think that's not bad. I don't want to get into the bad habit of waiting too long to begin. I'd like to continue to encourage people to join the class at the start. So let's go ahead and get down to work. We are in Parashat Chukkat, and as we are in the third triennial section, I've been trying to draw most of our study from that section, which I am hoping will bring to light some of the interesting things that happen in the final third of each Torah portion. It is not surprising that more people are familiar with the openings of many of the sections of the different Torah readings, and not quite as conversant with the end of each parasha. It's simply the nature of the beast. And of course, it's reinforced by the fact that during our morning minyan on Mondays and Thursdays, we read from the first aliyah as well. And then, of course, from Mincha on Shabbat, we also read from that first aliyah, that first portion of the text. So it gets a lot more screen time. But here at the end of Parashat Chukkat, we get something that is, I believe, very important and rather profound as we encounter the passing of one of the big three. From Exodus, of course, we have been accompanied by Moses, along with Miriam and Aaron. And Parashat Chukkat sees the death of both Miriam and Aaron. And here we find him passing in the end of chapter 20. So that's where we're going to start off. But we're going to see that despite the chapter break being where it is in contemporary, in the classical breakdown, that in fact the story of the death of Aaron is a natural lead-in to the beginning of chapter 21. So just don't get too surprised when we jump chapters. Setting out from Kadesh, the Israelites arrived in a body at Mount Hor. At Mount Hor, at the boundary of the land of Edom, Adonai said to Moses and Aaron, "Let Aaron be gathered to his kin. He is not to enter the land that I have assigned to the Israelite people, because you disobeyed my commands at the waters of Meribah." So this is a hearkening back to the striking of the stone when Moses and Aaron were trying to get water after the well that had been there because of Miriam had disappeared following her death. In their distress, in their moments of grief, they did not guide the nation properly. And as such, they too, along with the rest of the people who had been there earlier at the Exodus, were not going to be alive to enter the land of Israel. Miriam has already passed away, as I said, but now it is time for Aaron to go as well. Take Aaron and his son Eleazar and bring them up to the mountain on Mount Hor. Strip Aaron of his vestments and put them on his son Eleazar. There Aaron shall be gathered unto the dead, or more specifically, and Aaron will be gathered and die there. It is very sort of final. And as we can see in verse 25, we are getting a transition of authority, that Eleazar will become the new Kohen Gadol, the new high priest, and as such, he has to be properly attired in the clothing of the Kohen Gadol. And that will functionally mark that transition, because at any given time, there is only one Kohen Gadol officiating for the nation. And with Aaron gone, this is the first transfer of that authority that we will see in the Torah. All right, everybody with me so far? Okay. Verse 27. Moses did as Adonai had commanded. They ascended Mount Hor in the sight of the whole community. Moses stripped Aaron of his vestments and put them on his son Eleazar, and Aaron died there on the summit of the mountain. When Moses and Eleazar came down from the mountain, the whole community knew that Aaron had breathed his last. All the house of Israel bewailed Aaron 30 days. So we see the implementation of God's instructions with the going up to the mountain, the passing of Aaron, and the transfer of the vestments, transfer of the clothing prior to the passing. And then we see, of course, Moses and Eleazar coming down the mountain. Now, verse 29, the JPS translation here, we need to clutter it up a little bit, because otherwise you won't follow the commentary when we get to it. At the beginning of verse 29, it says that the whole community saw that Aaron was dead, that they saw the body of Aaron, if you will. And this is being euphemized, if you will, into the idea of the whole community knew that he was dead. Now, why would that need to be euphemized? Well, not because the Torah is at all uncomfortable about speaking about death, but because there is a certain logical difficulty, which is if Moses and Aaron and Eleazar went up the mountain and Aaron died at the top of the mountain and only Moses and Eleazar came down, then how can the nation see that Aaron is dead? Why would that make sense? So the JPS translation is smoothing that out for us so that we don't have that inconvenient question of seeing Aaron being dead by saying, no. Oftentimes, as is true, the term seeing just means understanding. And therefore, it just means they knew he's dead. And then, of course, we get the mourning period for Aaron lasting the 30 days, as is befitting for the death of the leader of the community. Okay, so we're going to come back to that site a little bit later on. But do you have any other questions or comments that people would like to ask or share? Okay, so like I said, there's no reason to put in a chapter break here because it is a natural following, as we'll see even more clearly in our commentary. When the Canaanite, king of Arad, who dwelt in the Negev, learned that Israel was coming by the way of the Atarim, he engaged Israel in battle and took some of them captive. Again, I have to just point out that the phrase that he took some of them captive is an interpretive phrase. It can be read simply, and he took captive, or he took from them captive. Now, it's not unreasonable to imagine that it was a plural captive. It's not unreasonable to imagine that it was single. It doesn't seem to be that big a deal in the verse, and JPS made their translation choice in a perfectly reasonable way. Obviously, because I'm dwelling on it, so will our commentators. But I want to just draw your attention to that for the moment. However, what we're seeing here is a defeat, that we lost this fight. And we lost this fight to a Canaanite king. That is significant. And now we see a reaction in verse 2. Then Israelite made a vow to Adonai and said, if you deliver this people into our hand, we will prescribe their towns. Now, prescribe, to put something under cherem in a military sense, means that when we fight back and when we win, we will not take any of the spoils from the battle. That we are fighting just for fighting, that is to say, for defense and survival. We are not fighting in order to loot. Now, in the modern sense, I know that all of us are good, modern, ethical soldiers, and we would never imagine anyone ever looting in the middle of a fight. Of course, for all of human history that we have any records for, looting went hand in hand with every fight imaginable. To fight and not take loot, it simply is like saying I went into the water but didn't get wet. It doesn't work. But in the biblical times, there are some commanded moments where we have to prescribe a section, the most famous, of course, being the struggle against the Amalekites by King Saul, for which he failed and was stripped of his kingship. But there are a number of times where the town must be put under cherem, and even though fought, no loot will be taken. Here, the people are voluntarily saying that they are willing to put the town under cherem, so they will fight back, and they will hope that God will allow them to be victorious, but they do not plan to take any of the spoils. And verse 3, we see the response. Adonai heeded Israel's plea and delivered up the Canaanites, and they and their cities were prescribed. So that place was named Hormah, which is, of course, a play on the word cherem, so that it is a place that was prescribed. Okay. Then they're going to set out from Mount Hor and move on to skirt the rest of the land of Edom. And then they start complaining again, and we get back into the very characteristic system in the book of Bamidbar of Numbers, where the people complain, a problem happens, then there is a repentance and a solution to the problem. But that is not for our shared study today. Today, we're going to focus on this king of Arad and this fight that happens between them. I know it's only 3 verses long, but it is significant. And together with the death of Aaron, forms a very instructive section. So, questions or comments before we get to our own traditional commentaries?
Yes, right. Quick question. And I don't know if we'll get into it. My art scroll associates this with Amalek.
We are indeed going to get into the question of who is this king of Arad?
Okay.
Who is this Canaanite down in the Negev? And spoiler alert, the traditional attribution is that this is Amalek, that these are the Amalekites, as I mentioned in passing with King Saul. So indeed, that is what is coming in our traditional commentary, but you're going to have to wait a few minutes for us to get there. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about Aaron's passing in order to see how this all goes. So we begin first just with an unusual change in the terminology for Aaron's passing. This commentary is spelled out, I think, best by Rabbeinu Bachya. The entire house of Israel wept for the passing of Aaron for 30 days. The expression Beit Yisrael, house of Israel, includes men and women, meaning this is really the most inclusive umbrella term possible. When the Torah reports the mourning of Moses, the word Beit is absent. As the Torah writes, the children, B'nai Yisrael, the children of Israel wept for the passing of Moses. Now they weep for the same amount of time, but it is a different term used. It is the Beit Yisrael that is mourning for Aaron, the house of Israel, and it is the B'nai Yisrael that is mourning for Moses, the children of Israel. Why a difference in language? The difference was that Aaron, in his capacity of striving always to restore harmonious relations between people, patched up many marriages. This is why men and women alike wept for his passing. So for Aaron's credit, he had a relationship with a much broader cross-section of the community, and he had done more to help that interpersonal relationship. Moses, of course, amazing leader, was absolutely essential for the survival of us all, and as the teacher and judge, was essential for justice and knowledge and wisdom being passed to all of our people. But let's be honest, the person who actually helps me fix a part of my life, in my most intimate of relationships in particular, is going to always have a special place in my heart. that is different than the more aloof and transcendent figure, even if that transcendent figure is greater by the objective measurements. Moses and Aaron were of two different caliber, but Aaron, in his actions, endeared himself to the people in a way that Moses did not. That is not a slur or slight on Moses at all. It is to Aaron's credit. Some people simply have that peacemaker capacity, and as such, there is a slight change in the terminology to help highlight that. Just another reason of why we should not think of Aaron as being just Moses's brother, because certainly for the families that he helped, Aaron was more dear to them than even Moses. But let's get back to this question about how this whole death and Arad all fit together. And we're going to be taking from Bamidbar Rabbah, the great midrash on Bamidbar in the book of Numbers. But I'm going to intersperse its narrative with some additional commentary, just as a usual either explanation or occasionally bringing counterpoints. But all of the sections that say Bamidbar Rabbah are one piece that I have broken up to make them a little bit more digestible. Then all the congregation saw that Aaron had died. Our verse that I mentioned with that seeing as opposed to just knowing. When Moses and Eleazar came down, the whole congregation assembled themselves against them and said, "Where's Aaron?" 3 people went up, 2 come down. Hey, what's going on here? They said to him, meaning Moses and Eleazar responded, "He is dead." They said to them, "How could the angel of death hurt him? A man who has halted the angel of death and held him back." It is so stated, number 17. So he, Aaron, stood between the dead and the living, and the plague was halted. It's like, wait a minute. You're telling me that Aaron could hold back a plague and prevent anyone from dying, but he just died on the top of a mountain and no one saw? I think that sounds a little sketchy, Moses and Eleazar. What's going on? They, the community, said to them, Eleazar and Moses, "If you bring him," meaning, come on, where's Aaron hiding, right? Well, what did you do with him? Well and good. If you bring him, that's fine. But if not, we will stone you. So the people are at the edge of armed revolt, according to this midrash, because they cannot conceive of the idea that Aaron has actually died. Aaron is too powerful. He is too great. He is too amazing. Death couldn't have any hold over him. He held death in his hand. And so now, because of that attitude, Moses and Eleazar are in a pickle. They are essentially being accused of either abducting or somehow murdering Aaron, or not being able to murder him, but at least getting rid of him. And they are now having to answer to the nation. At that time, Moses rose in prayer. He said, "Master of the world, bring us out from suspicion. Like, clear our name. How are we going to prove to them that nothing went wrong and that what we're telling them is true?" Immediately, the Holy One, blessed be he, opened the cave and showed him to them. It is so stated, Numbers 20:29, the section that we read. Then all the congregation saw that Aaron had died. Why does our verse say that the whole congregation saw, even though it's after the return of Moses and Eleazar, and the death would have happened on the mountain, as would the burial? Because the people were not believing of Moses and Eleazar that Aaron had died. And they needed the physical proof with their own eyes in order to be convinced that Aaron was actually gone. And this is, a fascinating part of the power of the personality of Aaron, and an important transition point. Remember, the people have already witnessed the death of Miriam and the repercussions from it. And now they are being asked to also accept in a short time the death of Aaron, which is even less plausible since they know that Aaron has had the power to stand against death. And of course, hiding behind all of this is the fear that what will happen to the nation when Moses dies. After all, we know that Moses is being eventually set up for a death all by himself, not even with a friend standing around. It's just him and God at the last moment. And the people need to be prepared in advance to accept that indeed Moses, Aaron, everyone, no matter how great, they are all mortal and they will die. And while in life they may have the capacity to help the nation, that doesn't mean that they will not die. It just means that their death will come when God says it is the right time for them to go. So this is a very important, instructive, and intermediate step in preparing the people for that true transition that's going to come. The transition from Aaron to Eleazar, so that we would have a continuous line of Kohanim, but even more dangerously, the transition that's going to be needed between Moses and Joshua to prepare the people for the entry into the land of Israel and to accept the transition of leadership to that next generation. So all of that is contained in that little "they saw him dead" addendum that seemed so unnecessary that the JPS translation almost glossed over it to avoid us having to think about it. And yet there was so much to learn about that transition of authority and of focusing on God rather than the individual who is being representative of God. So much is happening just in that tiny little verse. All right, questions before we see another way of interpreting this? All right, well, Chizkuni says, yeah, great midrash about seeing the body and everything, but since this verse cannot be understood literally, right? He just flat out says, look, there's no way that the people saw him dead. That just didn't work. It didn't happen, right? It doesn't make sense. He went up the mountain, he died, they came down. How are the people seeing him die, right? Clearly the death happened privately. Clearly the congregation was not watching it. Clearly the congregation didn't all go exhume the body to have it to be convinced. So if you can't understand it literally, it's no surprise then that the Targum, which is the translation of the Torah into Aramaic, that the Targum renders it as when the people witnessed Moses and Eleazar returning without Aaron, they drew the appropriate conclusions, right? It is understood, like our JPS translation, that the people understood that he had died. They saw Moses having ash on his head and having rent his garments, calling out to Eleazar, "Woe for my brother Aaron." So the Targum, and Chizkuni by extension, is trying to point out that, yes, our JPS translation is perfectly valid. That is an absolutely reasonable way to interpret this. We don't have to have a cave being opened to show the death of Aaron. We can understand the people understood that he had died. Now, if that's the case, why did I attack the JPS translation when we first began? Because we need to have the discomfort before we can have a resolution. We need to understand the rough bits in the text, the parts that don't seem to quite fit. And rather than just saying, nothing to see here, and moving on, we need to then find an explanation. Even if that explanation is, there's nothing to see here, meaning that it's just a figure of speech and the people understood that he was dead. And indeed, we can move on and there's nothing miraculous or profound. We can't get that until we notice that it is needed to make that interpretation. And of course, we can't get the insight of the Midrash, which may or may not be trying to represent a literal understanding of a cave being opened or not. We can't get the truth behind the Midrash, however, of the underlying tension of this moment of transition from Aaron to Eleazar and the foreshadowing of the transition from Moses to Joshua. None of that takes place if we don't look for the what's the term, the grit around which the pearl forms in the oyster. We have to find that unevenness in the text, and rather than ignore it or gloss over it, investigate it. And indeed, it may be, just like Chizkuni and the Targum are saying here, nothing so significant, but we may also find a lot to learn in the way, even if the literal meaning is perfectly mundane. All right, now let's pick up our Bamidbar Rabbah discussion of the after effects, because, like I mentioned, According to our breakdown of the text, the king of Arad comes immediately following the death. There is no chapter break. What is written after this, meaning in chapter 21:1, when the Canaanite king of Arad heard. All right, what's going on? What did he hear? Well, you find that once Aaron died, the clouds of glory withdrew, and they appeared like an unkempt woman. Now, what's going on here is the idea that the clouds that were over us, like a sukkah, that were there as a symbol of God's presence among us, were done in the honor of Aaron. The same way that the well was there in the honor of Miriam, here the clouds were in the honor of Aaron. When Aaron died, the clouds withdrew. Now, that doesn't mean that God withdrew, but it just meant that that particular manifestation was done in the honor of Aaron. Now, with the clouds gone, well, we looked vulnerable. We looked ripe for the attack. Now, we've already tussled with a number of opponents and shown ourselves formidable, but if our status vis-a-vis our relationship with God has now been degraded, as the disappearance of the cloud might lead an outside observer to conclude, well then, it is no surprise that the other people are going to want to take advantage of that. And who better to take advantage of it than somebody living in the Negev? Because after all, that's where we get this very specific terminology for this king of Arad living in the Negev. And who lives in the Negev? From Numbers 13, we know Amalek dwells in the land of the Negev. Now, he dwelt in the gap, meaning between the edges, along the periphery. He wasn't in the Canaanite lands in particular. He was along the edge of the Canaanite lands, right along those that borderland of the Negev, which were ripe pickings for trade routes and for travelers. And when he heard, meaning the nation of Amalek, that Aaron was dead and that the clouds of glories had departed, he immediately engaged them in battle. So the attribution of the Canaanite king as being from Arad, the king of Arad being Amalek, makes a lot of sense. There's much more to be found in both Bereshit Rabbah and other commentary if you wish to dig into the connection between Amalek and this king. It is quite convincing as an argument. But we don't have time to go into all of that today. But what we do have to talk about is the fact that Israel lost, because I kind of smoothed through that when we were first reading. But we should be shocked that Israel is losing a war against a Canaanite king, or even against Amalek. Why? I thought God was protecting us. What's going on here? I mean, yes, the clouds maybe disappeared, but does that mean that we're now vulnerable to attack? All right. So, indeed, Or HaHaim, I believe, summarizes it best. So we will read from his commentary of how we can understand this. We need to explain why the Israelites did not appear troubled by the fact that they suffered a defeat at the hands of a single Canaanite nation. We could have expected them to extrapolate that if a single Canaanite nation could inflict a defeat upon them, what would happen when they would face all 7 Canaanite nations? After all, we find precisely such a reaction by Joshua when he suffered a defeat at the hands of the inhabitants of the town of Ai, from Joshua 7. Okay, so the logical conundrum here is not why did we lose, but why don't the Israelites complain about losing? The book of Bamidbar, the Numbers, is full of Israelite complaints, often of trivial things, but here is a very significant and real concern. They are headed to Canaan, presumably to conquer the nation, and that means by the description of the Torah, they will have to conquer the 7 Canaanite nations that are inhabiting the land at that time. Well, if one Canaanite nation is able to defeat Israel in battle, will fighting 7 be easier? How is this going to work? And if the Israelites are willing to complain about their food, why are they not complaining about the loss in battle against the nation that they are supposed to be able to defeat? Now, one reason why we find that there isn't such a problem here is, of course, that this isn't a real Canaanite nation. This is Amalek, and we've already had tussles with Amalek where we had losses, so it's not quite as outstanding, but we can get a different explanation as Or HaChaim brings for us. According to our sages, the people described as the Canaanites were in reality the Amalekites, thus not such a big deal. When they found out that the attackers had not belonged to the 7 Canaanite nations, they were not overly concerned at the minor victory enjoyed by the Amalekites at the time. Their losses had been negligible. So on the one hand, there wasn't such a big deal because they weren't actually Canaanites. On the other hand, they were Amalekites, and we've already had fights with them before, and some of them did not always go our way. So our vulnerability to the Canaanites is not so surprising. But even more importantly, Or HaChaim is zeroing in on the idea that the losses were negligible, that this fight may have been a fight that needed to be recorded in the text, but it was not like the D-Day invasion. This was not Stalingrad. This was not a fight that led to a significant number of casualties. Now, he says negligible, but we're going to get into more detail on that. But before we get into the details of the fight and the losses, does anyone have any questions about this issue of fighting and victory and defeat at this point? Okay. So first, Ramban, bringing Rashi, very conveniently for me, so I don't have to bring 2 sources, gives us an understanding of what the losses were. So Rashi says that our losses were 1 maidservant. That was it, 1. That in all the fighting, no one was injured, no one was killed, but 1 maidservant, meaning 1 slave, was stolen from the Israelites by the Amalekites. Why do we believe this? Well, the sages said, they said this because they believe that Israel never suffered a defeat except at times when they sinned, such as at the first war with Amalek. But in all wars which were by command, meaning the wars that we were fighting because God told us to fight them and we were fighting them correctly and not having done anything wrong, not 1 man of them was missing throughout the days of Moses. Therefore, the sages explained this verse as meaning that they, the enemy, took captive from Israel that captive whom they, meaning Israel, had in their possession, meaning that the Amalekites recaptured somebody that we had captured from them. So it was taking back, and thus a rather insignificant loss. And that was all that was missing at this time. We're going to get back to why a singular maidservant is necessary for this midrash, but we'll continue for the moment. According to the plain meaning of Scripture, the sense of the verse is that the Canaanites did not kill any of the Israelites, but took a few of them captive. And when God later on delivered them into their hands, they brought them all back, and not a single one of them was missing. However, you need not go down the single maidservant taken captive or recaptured explanation. You can also read it in the Peshat, says Ramban, who is not always a Peshat kind of interpreter, but here he says that's perfectly fine, that yeah, there was a fight. No one actually died. A few Israelites were taken captive, but we got them back in the second round of the fight, and everybody was fine and hunky-dory. So Ramban gives both a midrashic look, the singular maidservant taken, as well as a simple look, a peshat look, a plain reading look, which says, no, probably some Israelites were captive, but no one killed, and even those captives were recovered in the second stage of the war. Now, how do we explain that there was only 1 female maidservant, that was the captive? Why, of all of the interpretations, why would that be the one to occur to the commentaries? Well, Siftei Chachamim, who often brings very helpful commentary on Rashi himself, explain it as follows. We need not ask how Rashi knew there was only 1, for one can answer that the term shvi in our text implies that there was only 1. And I'll just refresh your memory back here at the start of at the start of chapter 21 and the end of verse 1, where it says Shavi, right? That this was a singular noun, and therefore it is perfectly reasonable to imagine that it was a singular captive. The word is written in the singular, and even though sometimes, yes, a singular word can mean a plural group, there's no reason that it has to. So why not interpret it as being just one? Now, you might also ask how Rashi knew that the captive was a maidservant. Why do we believe this was a woman that was taken as opposed to a man? The answer is that the term Shavi implies a maidservant. How do we know this? For in Parashat Bo, concerning the warning before the 10th plague, the death of the firstborn, it is written, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits on his throne to the firstborn of the maidservant. That's how it is first introduced in Exodus 11. Whereas later, when the plague struck, the actual fulfillment of that plague, it is written, until the firstborn of the Shavi, meaning captive, and this is in from Exodus 12. Now, you can put together a little bit of a parallel here. In the prediction, it would be from Pharaoh to maidservant, female form, and in the fulfillment, it is from Pharaoh to captive in an ambiguous form, but obviously the captive would be parallel to the maidservant from the initial warning. Therefore, that term Shavi would imply a female captive, a female maidservant, if you will. As such, one female maidservant was taken, and that was it. That was it. For this, we needed a description of a whole battle and a fight. One person was taken, the Israelites prayed, and then, they got them back. I mean, and the towns were wiped out. Is this worthy of being cataloged? Well, obviously, because, it's in the Torah. And obviously there is much for us to try and uncover. But before we get to sort of our general discussion of that, let's just take a look a little bit about why the Amalekites and the Canaanites and all of this, what was going on with all of this? After all, why not just say that it was Amalek? Why have this idea of Canaan at all? Well, again, turning back to Rashi, he gives us a good explanation. This was Amalek, but he purposely changed his speech, taking in the Canaanite tongue, so that Israel might thereby be misled and would pray to the Holy One, blessed be he, that he should give the Canaanites into their power, whilst really they were not Canaanites, and their prayer would be ineffectual against the Amalekites. Okay, you got to follow the Amalekite logic here. Last time we fought the Israelites, they prayed to God, and God made us lose. Well, what if we go in disguise by changing our language? What if we shout at them in Canaanite languages rather than Amalekite languages so that they think we're actually Canaanite? And then what are they going to do? They're going to pray, oh God, help us defeat these Canaanites. But of course, we aren't Canaanites, and that means their prayer won't work. Okay, now this is perfectly fine logic for the ancient world, that a person praying for the defeat of Frank, when it's not really Frank, well, that prayer isn't really going to work, because you got to be precise in your language, and your God's not going to listen to you if you make mistakes. That is not an unusual interpretation of how the interaction between the humans and the divine would work in most of the ancient world. So in some ways, the Amalekites are coming up with a pretty cunning plan. But we have a problem. The Israelites perceived that their clothing was the clothing of the Amalekites, while their language was the language of the Canaan. So the Israelites noticed this discrepancy. They thereupon said, let us pray against our enemies in general terms, without mention of any names, as it is stated in verse 2, and they said, if you will indeed give this people into my hand. Because we do get this rather unusual phrase where it says to give Ha'am Hazeh, this nation, this people, into our hands, without actually specifying that it is the Canaanite or the people of the king of Arad or the people from the Negev or any other of the usual more specific terms, we get this more generic term. And the interpretation is trying to tell us it went especially generic because the Israelites were confused who they were actually fighting. And that's really important, because knowing who your enemy is kind of the first step towards defeating someone. Knowing who the danger is, knowing where the danger is coming from, is rather essential. And just as the Israelites were all set on the specificity of seeing Aaron's body and had to be convinced or had to be prepared for the notion that you don't need to focus on Aaron versus Eleazar. You focus on the fact that God has given you a leader. You don't have to focus between Moses and Joshua. You focus that God has given you a leader. Here too, don't focus on, is this a Canaanite? Is this an Amalekite? Is this a whateverite? Focus on, there is a danger here. And the danger needs to be responded to. And we will respond as necessary to overcome that danger. And by making their speech go more generic, by saying this people, Ha'am Hazeh, rather than these Amalekites, the Israelites, of course, are winning, but more importantly, they are learning. And they are learning to recognize that not all enemies are going to show up with a big sign above their head that says enemy. Not all enemies are going to show up in a way that Israel is used to. Some of them may show up pretending to be friends, as indeed we see when Joshua invades the land of Canaan and gets stuck with that particular conundrum. And some of them may appear to be good to some, but be bad to us, as of course the great Amalekite descendant Haman would do, who tried to portray himself as being good for the nation while being terrible for us. And that willingness to say, look, just defend us against our enemies. I'm not going to make a list of our enemies because I don't always know. There could be people that are my enemy that I think are my friend, and there could be people that would be willing to be my friend that I think are my enemy. God, help me fight against the people I need to fight against. God, help defend me against the people that are my enemies, whoever they may be, whatever they may be called, whatever they're dressed like, and whatever Canaanite or Amalekite language they're speaking. Just help us, and we will be okay. And indeed, that was successful. Now, why the Amalekites in particular? Well, because the Amalekites, as we finish with Bamidbar Rabbah, occupy a very special theological, philosophical, psychological role in the psyche of Israel and Judaism. From time immemorial, Amalek has been a lash for the punishment of Israel. You find that when they said, back in Exodus 17, is the Lord among us or not, immediately in Exodus 17:8, Amalek came. That was the first fight with Amalekites. And why did it come? Because we were griping. And here, from our section, Numbers 20:29, then all the congregation saw that Aaron had died. Wait a minute. What needs punishment here? Why is this a sin? Why are we being punished by Amalekites? You find that when Aaron died, Amalek went out against them and Israel retreated back 7 stages, meaning 7 steps in our journey towards Israel. Thus it is stated in Deuteronomy 10:6, then from the wells of Bnei Yakan, the children of Israel journeyed to Mosera. There Aaron died. But did Aaron die there? No. Did he not die on Mount Hor? Yes. So the verses are evidence of 7 stages backwards from Mount Hor to Mosera to teach you that Israel had retreated. So why did Amalek come? Because we had chosen to run. Our crime, if you will, was that with the loss of Aaron, we had retreated. Whether it was physical or not is something that we can debate in history class. But more importantly, spiritually, psychologically, emotionally, the people were feeling not only grief at the loss of Aaron, but were feeling vulnerable. Indeed, the whole metaphor of the cloud of glory being removed from us implies that the people were still attaching their sense of faith, their sense of protection to the presence of individual human beings. Remember, that was the problem with the golden calf back on day one, when the people were looking for a physical presence to represent God for them. Here too, they are still focused on a physical presence. And what the Midrash is saying is that with the loss of that physical presence of Aaron, the people were feeling weaker. They weren't weaker. Yes, grieve and cry for the loss of the great man Aaron and everything he did for so many families to help them be together, but recognize that God is still there. God is still with you, and you need not fear the loss of that particular individual human being. Unfortunately, the people were not quite there yet, but they would eventually. Eventually, we will get better transitions between one leader and the next. Eventually, we will have a little bit more consistency, a little. But this is always the temptation when you have a great and beloved leader to focus on them to such an extent that their loss seems like the loss of everything, when in fact their loss is a real loss, but whatever they stood for, whatever they were guiding you towards is still there. And that hope needs to endure regardless of the setbacks. And Amalek as a symbolic punishment against us for that lack of clarity of vision and faith is really very much that psychological lash of self-doubt, of feeling abandoned when in fact we are not, of feeling that we are incapable when in fact we have great capability. That's that internal turmoil that must be overcome. And indeed, that has always been the great challenge for Israel, is to recognize the greatness of its purpose and potential, and to not allow that Amalekite doubt to say that we are weak and easily overcome to eat away at us. And even if we don't have a physical Amalekite to fight, for indeed the Amalekites are long since gone in the dust of history, we still have that self-doubt and that that worry of self-worth that needs to be overcome. So we may not have Aaron, we may not have Moses, but we are still Israel and we still have God. And that means that we need to continue to march forward and not retreat. And I will leave my comments there and open the floor again for any other comments or questions.
With this fight, this war just kind of leaps out in the text without any sort of warning. That's what strikes me about it. They were blindsided. They didn't realize perhaps they were being tracked, hunted from a distance by an enemy that was just waiting for the right time. And it's a kind of a reminder that, you know, we can think about faith and keeping our guard up, the walls up for Torah, but you know, in times of transition, if we drop our guard, things can happen.
Those transition moments, those liminal moments are indeed very precarious. But you know, that's, I think, what the Torah is trying to teach us here. Not that they are precarious, because we all know that, but that they need not be so precarious. That indeed we already had a successor to Aaron. And as we know later, there will be a successor to Moses, and there will be a successor to Joshua, and so on and so forth. Indeed, in Pirkei Avot, one of the great insights from the very first chapter is the chain of the Masorah, of the tradition, to remind us that despite everything, it has continued to be passed down. We continue to move forward. There is a continuity of peoplehood, of leadership, of strength, despite the passing of each generation, because that we're guaranteed that every generation will eventually pass. But that doesn't have to be a cause for fear. For grief, of course, we always wish that Moses would live longer. We always wish that the last generation would stay with us for another day, another year, however long we could. But fear is unnecessary, and fear leads to this Amalekite reprisal. But that's the lesson from the Torah. Not that it's inevitable, but that it is something that we can prepare and then overcome. Any other questions or comments? All right. Well, thank you all. I really enjoy getting back to study again. And a reminder, Mishnah class also resumes tonight. and the Pathway to Judaism class also resumes tomorrow. So take care, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your July.
Thank you, Rabbi.